Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am O'Brien McMahon, and this is People Business. I read a story recently, a piece of Mongolian folklore about a boy named Tarva who lived way back years and years ago during a time of plague. And as the world around him was crumbling and dying, he decided that he did not want to suffer a long disease, and so he would leave his body early and venture to the underworld. But when he got to the underworld, he was greeted by the ruler down there, the Khan of the underworld, who greeted him with confusion and said, "Boy, what are you doing here?" And he explained what was happening on Earth and in his village. And the Khan said, "Well, I'm sorry, but this is not your time. You have to go back." But he took pity on the boy, and he appreciated the boy's bravery and willingness to face his own death. And so he said, "Before you go, I'll grant you a gift. You can bring back with you anything you want from the underworld." And he showed him around, and within the underworld, within the land of the dead, there was every experience, every item, and anything you could find in the land of the living also existed in the land of the dead. There was immense treasure and riches and all of these things that you would think of as creating material success in the world. But when the Khan asked the boy Tarva what he wanted to bring back, Tarva responded, "I'd like to bring back stories." And when he returned to his body, Tarva found that his body had suffered pretty significantly, but he had this new gift of storytelling. And it wound up making him rich in a number of ways, beyond just the physical sense or the material sense of being able to tell stories and get his message across and build wealth. He was able to see into the future by telling stories of what might come. He was able to help those around him by telling stories of what they might be experiencing or what might happen. And he wound up becoming one of the key figures of the Mongolian folklore. And my guest on the podcast this week is Sue Rice, and she is the Tarva of this episode. She is the author of a book, Tiny Thunder, Irresistible Messaging for an Overwhelmed World. And we talk about the power of metaphoric storytelling, how to use a story to create an emotion or an image in somebody that helps an idea just land in their head and click in place and spur that person to take action on that idea, whatever the action is that we're trying to get them to take. I was very excited for this conversation. I had come across her book through a friend and former podcast guest, Tony Leonard, who had recommended it. I devoured it as quickly as I could. It's a pretty short read, a very easy audiobook, and really took a lot away, and wanted to get her on the podcast. And she agreed right away to come on and share the lessons of Tiny Thunder. I hope you enjoy it. I think this kind of storytelling could really have an impact for a lot of different people in a lot of different uses. We talk about copywriting, we talk about sales, but I really think corporate communications, how we talk to employees, I think being able to use metaphor and being able to use metaphoric storytelling is really a key piece that could spice things up, make things more interesting, grab the attention that is so hard to get in today's world, and get your message across. So without further ado, here is Sue Rice. Sue Rice, welcome to the show. Very excited to have you on and talk about one of my favorite topics today, storytelling.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
How did you become a storyteller?
I think that all of us are storytellers, even if we're not conscious of it or not. I think I became more and more of a storyteller. I do email marketing. I'm a copywriter and a strategist. So I was always looking for kind of fresh, original ways to show up in the inbox because there's so much unfresh stuff out there. And so I just started telling, I would even call them stories. I would call them like little story snacks, right? It wasn't like I was going on a hero's journey. I was just telling little anecdotes and linking up those little vignettes to my clients' products or their process or the pain points that they were addressing. and it took off like wildfire, basically. So, and then I think, storytelling is a bit like a muscle when you exercise. Like the more you do it, the more you see stories everywhere, and it just becomes more and more fun, and you kind of enter into this virtuous storytelling circle.
Well, so you just teased a bunch of things that we're going to talk about in this conversation in that intro, which was great, whether you did it on purpose or not. But I guess, what role do you see stories playing in our everyday lives? We'll start broad, and then I want to get into those vignettes. But let's just start with story in general. What is the role of story? How do you think about story?
So to me, story, I mean, a lot of people have talked about this. We're all sort of, as human beings, we're hardwired to be storytellers and story listeners. It is how we make sense of our world. It's how we connect with each other. And I feel like it's a way, I think it's more and more needed, because I feel like as we are full on in the digital world now and the AI and all of that, I feel like the storyteller is that much more needed. It's a way of connecting that nothing else does quite the same way. It's connecting dreams and experiences and feelings and places and people. And even what's interesting is, even when you tell a story and the person that's listening to it is diametrically opposed to you politically or whatever, you can still make a connection with that individual, which is what I think is so beautiful about it.
So there's kind of an interesting thing that happens when people talk about storytelling. I think maybe it's a little bit less now. The storytelling is a little bit in vogue right now in the working world. But I think when you talk about storytelling, it's easy to think of it as an art form, and art being something that's done outside of work. It's something that's done outside of the day-to-day things you have to get done. What do you say to that? Like, what role do you see story playing in work? And what do you say to people who feel like maybe, that it's just that there's not a place for that? That work is where you come in and you get down to business.
So a couple things I'd like to say about that. First thing, because I do know, and I've actually gotten this reaction for decades. I remember being in Switzerland doing a presentation to McKinsey, I think McKinsey Europe, I can't remember exactly. And someone said, this isn't, and I was telling the story of where women were in their heads it was in the 90s, right? So it was sort of like a story documentary, if you will. And I can remember someone saying, there's not enough data. I don't believe this. And I feel like a lot of business people feel that storytelling isn't serious. And what I would say to them is, if you really know how the human brain works, obviously you need logic. Obviously you need data. We all know that. But if that logic and that data is, if you will, sort of naked and not wrapped up, or at least presented in part through storytelling, you're only grabbing people half the way. And how we think unconsciously and how we make decisions is very much on the other side of the brain, the creative side of the brain, the emotional side of the brain, the storytelling side of the brain. So if you really want to be powerfully persuasive, you need to be talking to both sides of the brain, or you are going to have a harder and harder time to achieve the results that you want. So I think that there are, if you really look at how the brain works, and neuroscience has come a long way in understanding that, I think assuming that storytelling isn't serious and sort of play is a serious mistake. So that's one thing. The other thing I would say that I think is super important to talk about, and I think we'll get into as we talk today, but in business, the business world right now, what has been in vogue for several years now is this idea of brand storytelling. And everyone talks about the hero's journey, and it's sort of like taking the Hollywood storytelling tapestry and applying it to the brand story or the brand owner's story or the company's story. And there's nothing wrong with that. All that's great. But what I would say about that, first of all, I don't think most of us talk in hero's journeys. If you sit down at the dinner table, you don't say, I have a hero's journey that you're just going to love to hear. You talk in little, no one talks that way. We talk stream of consciousness. We talk with anecdotes. We illustrate what we want to talk about in a completely different way. And I think that the brand storytelling is a great start. I think it's something that should be in every company's arsenal, but I think it has a short runway. I know because I'm a copywriter and a strategist, and I've used brand storytelling. And at a certain point, we can't keep saying the same thing over and over again. We need to expand it, which is why I think that we need to kind of open up our perspective to how we can use storytelling when it comes to building community, building brands, and boosting the bottom line. And we can go beyond the brand story and kind of cast our net much wider. I hope that answered your question.
No, it did. And that was a fantastic answer. And it segued right into where we want to go, which is if we're not thinking of it as the hero's journey, how should we be thinking about storytelling? And I guess we can focus it on work storytelling, or we can focus it on any other version of storytelling that you want. But to your point, there are books out there that I've read. There are podcasts I've listened to where it talks about the hero's journey, and every story needs to be the hero's journey and go on this arc, and you have to resist the call and then, head out, and you have a guide, and you come up against a challenge or an obstacle and you overcome it and you come home with the treasure, and, the whole thing. But you're arguing that maybe there's a place for that, but that's not necessarily the way everybody should be thinking about it in a day-to-day practical standpoint. So how should people be reframing this?
The way I like to, if I can, I will, I feel like the best way to describe this is imagine yourself at a dinner table with your friends. All right. Maybe it's Thanksgiving. Maybe it's just a Friday night dinner. And think about the conversation that you have with these people. Like I said, no one on that table is going to be sharing their hero's journey. It just doesn't happen. What they will be saying is, oh, did you see that meme on TikTok? What do you think about that story about what X did? Or that was quite a game Sunday afternoon, wasn't it? Quite a game. That's the kind of thing that we're talking about. And we often do it all in one conversation, right? We're kind of flip from little anecdote to the next, right? So I started thinking about how you could use that to make a point, whether you're a nonprofit organization, a mother, a teacher, or a business that's trying to make money, how you can use the normal way that we converse as human beings through many little stories, and how we can communicate using that as a vehicle. And that's when I came up with this concept of Tiny Thunder, which is basically using a story to metaphorically illustrate a value, a challenge you help people overcome, a process. And I started experimenting with it, and it works really, really well. I experimented with it in email marketing, but you can use it everywhere. You can use it in sales presentations. You can use it in social media. You can use it pretty much anywhere. And so I feel like by doing that, it's a much more natural way to use stories, because it's how we talk. Just kind of think about it. Next time you talk with someone, a friend that you haven't seen, just think about what that conversation is. You talk about your kids, you talk about what someone else did, and it's all a big jumble, and it all makes sense.
Yeah. So let's break this down a little bit, because when I had reached out to you, so I read Tiny Thunder. Friend of mine and a guest on the podcast, Tony Leonard, shout out to Tony, had posted on LinkedIn that he was reading your book. And I saw the post and I said, this looks like something I'm totally into. So I downloaded it, like tore through it. It's not very long, very accessible because you use the format you're talking about. So it's very accessible. And I reached out to you and I said, I feel like this is kind of a missing piece in my head around how we use storytelling in an effective way. And I think that missing piece centers around effective use of metaphor. And so can you just explain, we'll go all the way back, like what is a metaphor?
Okay. So when I say, if I could just back up for a second, when I say metaphoric storytelling, it's like I can kind of, even if I don't see the person, I can kind of feel their eyes glazing over like, what the heck is that? Right? Like, I am not in English class anymore. So to kind of make this all less intimidating, the best way to think about metaphor in my book, I look at it as a metaphoric family. Whether it's similes or metaphors or whatever, all of these sort of English devices do one thing, and they compare. It's about comparison. It's about comparing unlike things with each other so that you compare. So one of the examples in the book, I don't know if you remember this example, was when the Great Train Robbery in the 1920s, the guy who did that said it was his Sistine Chapel. He was comparing a train robbery with one of the most famous artistic endeavors of humankind, right? Totally, they're completely separate things. They're completely opposite. And yet, when you hear that, you kind of get it because it's like it was his, sort of moment of greatness that he was able to pull that off. It was his masterpiece. And that is what a metaphor does. A good metaphor does is it compares two totally unlike things and you're like, whoa, that's a new idea. And that is what makes it so powerful. So you can start talking about something that's completely unrelated to your product, your service, your idea, your cause, whatever it is. And you draw people in by doing that. And then you juxtapose it with the point that you're trying to make. And if you're clever about the stories that you choose, it works. It's almost like a drug, right? It literally is like crack for the mind because it's so addictive. That's one piece. But the other piece that's so interesting about it is if I tell you a metaphor, a fresh one that you had never heard of before, it's sort of like you and I are, it's not me talking to you. It's like it's like I'm telling you a joke and you're getting it. There's an interactivity to it. I tell the metaphor and you unwrap it. And that is also an element that a lot of communications, as we know today, is super flat, right? But, it's like, oh, I get that. That's great. That's a great way. And the thing about it is once they get the metaphor, they never forget your message. Your message will never be forgotten. I mean, sales teams could use it, right? And I feel like, because instead of just saying, this is my widget, you can present the widget in this wonderful new way that people will never forget your proposition.
So that makes sense to me because what I hear you saying is a metaphor makes the other person, the receiving person, have to do just enough work that they take ownership of the thought. And I think there's a human principle where, if we're going to learn something, if we're going to really have something be meaningful, we need to be owning a piece of that experience. We need to be engaged. Our mind needs to be active in a certain way. And what I hear you saying is when you use a metaphor, you're turning the brain on in the other person to get them even just a little bit, but just enough to get them to engage in what it is that you're saying. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think it's important. I actually have never really thought about it that way. It's sort of like you're in cahoots. Instead of like having someone push a promotion on you, the two of you are kind of having a dialogue, even though you're not
co-creating.
actually having one.
Yeah.
You're co-creating. Yes. There you go.
Yeah. So you said if you're clever in how you do it, it can have a big impact. So can you talk to what makes an outstanding metaphor versus what's kind of your flat run-of-the-mill metaphor?
Well, I think the rule's kind of simple. It's, if you've heard the comparison before, it's bad. If you haven't heard it before, it's good. It's fresh. It's original. It's something but it requires, and in our sort of copy and paste template world, AI driven world, it requires some thinking, which I think sometimes it requires, thinking a little bit about what it is that you want to communicate, first of all, and then what would illustrate that. Let me give you an example. So I don't know if you read this story. I love this story. There was a guy who was flying from Bahamas to Miami earlier in 2022, I think. And it was a small private plane. It was just a hop, skip, and a jump over to Miami. And he looked up and he saw that the pilot was slumped over at the wheel of the plane, and the plane was flying, right? And he's like, oh, that's probably not a good sign. And so he pushed the pilot aside and he got trying to fly a plane, which of course he'd never done before. And he called the air traffic control. He said, we've got a problem here. The pilot is out and I've never flown a plane before. Can you help me? Right. So they got a guy on who...
I remember this.
Right. So they got a guy on to kind of talk him in to landing into Miami. As he was landing, he went off the radar. And of course, everyone couldn't breathe in the air traffic controller because they would assume the worst, right? You heard the crackling noise after about 30 seconds. And then you heard, okay, I'm on the runway. What do I do now? And the guy, he was going way too fast. And anyway, he was fine. So that story's a great story, right? And you could use that story to illustrate the importance of mentorship, the importance of support, the importance of making sure that you have experts behind you when you're flying a plane that you don't know how to fly, which is kind of like how all of our lives is most of the time, right? Like, if you don't know how to do your finances, or if you don't know how to start your business or whatever it is, you could use that. You could apply that story in so many ways. If you are a company that is providing support and a service to help people kind of walk through a process. And it has nothing to do with the financial industry or the whatever it is, but it's a great illustration of how you can go and know nothing. And if you have someone who's calm and an expert and knows what they're doing, they can walk you through it, even in the most kind of hardest of times. And I think but that isn't something that you would, most people would say, we can help you step through this process. That's what we would normally say. But wouldn't it be great if you put that little story in front of it, and like, you won't forget the message. You'll never forget that message, and you'll never forget that story, right?
Yeah. So I don't know how to ask this as a question. I want to sound smart and ask this as a question and draw it out of you, but I don't know how. So I'm just going to say it and you can respond to it. One of the things that I think is so impactful about metaphor, and again, the category of metaphoric language, is the visuals in your head. And I guess the question is, how important are the visuals, and how do you create the right visuals, and how should people be thinking about the visuals that are going on in somebody else's head when they're communicating?
So first of all, in a way, the word metaphoric storytelling is a little bit redundant, because in the end, a metaphor is just a really shortened story, right? And so it's like kind of a story on steroids, if you will. And a metaphor, but what metaphors and stories both do, and it's proven, is that they create huge images. They're very image oriented. Our brains, when things are image oriented, we retain information much more easily, which is why both storytelling and metaphors are so powerful when it comes to persuasion, when it comes to getting people to act, etc. So that I kind of want to preface with that. So one of the things that is, there's a woman who coaches sales teams about how to use metaphors. Her name's Ann Miller. She's written a couple of books about it. And one of the things that she says, because I want to give her due on this, she talks about the fact that all of us have a scrapbook in our head of memories, of feelings, of experiences. So when you are selecting the metaphor and the image that you want people to come up with, you want to be sure that you're tapping into that scrapbook, right? So for example, if I were selling to a French audience and I started talking about American football, guess what? I'm not tapping into their scrapbook at all. And so you need to be careful about, that's where you need to be careful in terms of your choice of metaphor, because the image that it will bring up needs to be something that people will be nodding their head and getting, if that makes sense. So the metaphors that you might, depending on your audience, the metaphor you might be using for a certain age group or a certain demographic could be completely different depending on, who you're talking to. I always like to give the example of, so I live in France and I have this old antique car that is called a deux chevaux. I don't know. You've seen them in the movies. They're like the classic French old car, and they're very difficult to find. And I bring my car out maybe like 2 or 3 times a year and drive down to the village in it. And every single time that I drive down to the village in it, it's a convertible, not because in that fancy way, but I can't explain it. It's like a material flap. So it has to be a convertible. And I stop the car in the middle of the village, and within 30 seconds, there are like 10 60 plus men who are 60 and over surrounding the car like, oh, I remember when I was a kid, I had a car like this. And every time I do that, I think, now their scrapbook, if I were to make an ad for 60 plus men in France, the deux chevaux would be in it, right? Because that is what triggers. But if that one image triggers all these other emotions, that's what you're trying to get at. That's the reason I'm telling that story, is that you try to think of something that will trigger a set of experiences and emotions through one mechanism, if that makes sense.
Sure. And I mean, how much do you have to pay attention to the negative impressions that people have, or because you and I could have both had experiences with that car, but so here's an example. So I had a friend growing up who had a VW Bug convertible, and like everybody loved that car, and there were a bunch of similarly, there were people who'd be really nostalgic about those.
Right. Traditional.
Yeah.
Thing. Yeah.
Yeah. My mother, when she was growing up, her older brother had a Bug, and he got into an accident and was killed when he was 16. And so I mentioned that my friend had gotten that car, and she looked at me and she said, "You're never allowed in that car. You're never allowed to go with him. It's not against him, but I don't trust those cars. You're never allowed to go in that car." And so, somebody can look at those and have such a great memory. Like my friend from high school, he probably looks back on that car and just like has so much nostalgia and love for it. And yet, my mom is just filled with grief. And so when you're telling stories, like how much do you have to pay attention are we getting in the weeds too much to think about like how our stories could drum up negative impressions in other people, or should we be thinking about that in some way?
I'm not sure you can 100% avoid that. Like, I wouldn't, if I were to have told a story about a VW bug, I wouldn't know that in my audience, if your mother was in my audience, that had happened, right? So I feel like there is a limit to how you can protect from personal experiences triggering people negatively. But I think that there's some safer story. Like, for example, the story I just told about the guy flying the plane. If I told that story and someone in their family had died in a private plane crash, I would be triggering them, right? But I would say 99% of the people listening to it would understand sort of the humor in it. And the guy jumped out of the plane at Miami with flip-flops and torn jeans. Like, right. It was like, I think people could kind of get the humor in it as well. So, but I don't think you can 100%. But what I was talking about in terms of the scrapbook, I'm not sure for someone who's a really buttoned up finance guy, whether I'd be telling stories from rom-coms, right? I might be sourcing them from something else, like, to the movie scenes that I picked, or the books that I would pick would probably vary in tone depending on my main prospect. But if you hit a home run, you can, there are things like books and movies are collective experiences, right? I mean, I see it on some of these groups in Facebook where, I grew up in Silicon Valley and in a town called Atherton. And I see people telling stories, and man, that stuff is powerful. There are thousands of people on that group talking about the restaurants they used to go to and the sort of the nostalgia. Someone once said to me, one of the most powerful emotions out there is nostalgia, which I thought was interesting. There's collective experiences, whether the person grew up in the 80s or the 90s or the 70s or whatever decade it was, you could dip into that. The music as well, right? The movies, the books, the childhood books that people read. We all have huge, strong emotions linked to all of that, I think. Mostly positive. But if I could say one thing though, I know a lot of people who don't do this. I personally avoid divisive topics. And the problem is people can become divisive, right? There are people that I've told stories about, famous people that I have now removed from my story library, because they are just too divisive. There are too many people that don't. And the problem is people end up concentrating on the divisiveness and not on what you're trying to.
Yeah. Unless the point is to highlight the divisiveness.
Unless the point is to highlight the divisiveness.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. It depends on the emotion you're trying to elicit, because I remember I live in Chicago, which is a quite liberal city. And I went to see a stand-up comedian, and he started telling some stories about Trump in an unfavorable light that got, pretty positive responses from the audience. And then he started telling some stories about Biden in a not so positive light. And you could feel everybody kind of go, whoa, what just happened?
Bristling.
And the whole punchline was, hey, did nobody tell you? You don't have to like any of these people. And it was like everybody went, oh, okay, I get it. And it was because he had set everybody up to feel uncomfortable that the point he was trying to make landed. And so I think there is a place for that. But in business storytelling, I don't know that you're going for that emotion too often. I think it, yeah. Because I feel like my personal opinion is to avoid that. But I do know people who purposefully go into those conversations. So, yeah, I feel like, some people like to say, kind of, if you either hate me or you love me, kind of. But I feel like I'm not sure that's necessary. So, Yeah. And that could be a style thing too. I have a partner who is much more direct than I am. And he can say things that I would never be able to get away with, but he can say them because it's just much more fitting with his personality. Similarly, I've heard, there are some comedians who won't touch those types of jokes. And I've heard others who say that they want to purposefully go over the edge at the beginning of a show and then try to get the audience back by the end of the show, because that's kind of that's their style of thing. And I think you have to be very cautious and skilled if you're going to push the envelope like that. But yeah, I think for most everybody, for 95% of people out there, you just got to be conscious of how your stories are going to land.
Think about it with the scrapbook. Also, what people relate to, I think, is the more important question. Like, I'm not sure an all-female, this might be an all-female 45 plus group. I'm not sure I'm going to be talking a ton about rugby or, about a certain sport or, but I could be wrong about that. But I feel like from just sort of my knowledge of people, that's probably not going to be the best way to tap into their scrapbook in their mind. Right?
Yeah, that I may have taken us far afield by going down that line of questioning. I think your advice of, beware of your audience and their scrapbook and pay attention and try not to pick things that are going to offend people. I think that's probably the sage advice, and we can move on from that one. But you mentioned nostalgia being one of the most, I forget how you say it, but it's one of the deepest emotions that we can tap into, what powerful emotions we can tap into. What are the other powerful emotions? So if we're communicating, if we're thinking about putting these types of stories together, what are other emotions that we want to or might want to be eliciting from people and coming up with stories that pull on those emotions?
Well, I think it's kind of, you think about, there's certain values and certain sort of pain points that unite us all. I think all of us have fears about not being recognized or concerns about not being recognized, not being seen, feeling invisible, feeling insecure, the whole idea of imposter syndrome, feeling insecure about our abilities and whether or not people will, I feel like fears about being successful or not. And I feel like there's a lot of sort of human conditions that unite us, no matter whether we're whatever age we are, whatever sex we are, whatever it is, we are all united by those certain kind of common anxieties, frustrations, stress, all those kinds of things. Anything like that, I think that if you can tell a story that demonstrates that you understand those concerns, and then very, not too heavy-handedly, but then make a segue into how you can help them solve that in a certain area of their life, right? Because we are all united by that. We all are stressed. We all don't have enough time. Most of us don't have enough money. And if we do have enough money, then we have stresses related to that, right? So it's like, I feel like there's a lot of things that unite us. We all worry about our kids, right? We worry about the environment. There's just a lot of things that unite us that we can tap into and then just say, I can't solve it all, but I can certainly help you in this area.
Yeah. As you were saying that, it just occurred to me that probably the best metaphoric storytellers are the folks at Pixar, because every one of their movies is tapping into some very deep element of the human condition and telling it through a medium that has nothing to do with that condition, but yet makes the point so well.
But you can tell a metaphoric story in a blink of an eye. Like the other day I was on LinkedIn, which is a platform that I have grossly neglected and I'm starting to use more of. But there's actually a ton of metaphoric storytelling on that platform, oddly enough. And there was someone who posted a little video, literally must have been 10 seconds max, of a truck that was turning around on a tiny sort of, I don't know, Himalayan road that, like, if you went 1 inch the wrong way, you'd go off the cliff, right? So, and it was just about this car, and it's such a vivid image. Yeah. And the post was, you can always turn your life around. And like, you'll never forget that message. And so you can, it doesn't have to be elaborate. It can be, you can do something as simple as that and tap into the power of metaphoric storytelling. You don't even have to have a ton of words. You can use visuals to create the visual. There are a lot of shortcuts to using this method that I think work really well. And so I think that it doesn't have to be a movie. It doesn't have to be a book. It doesn't have to be a chapter in a book or a scene from a movie. It can be even a tiny slice of that to do the job that it can do.
Yeah. And that was a question I was going to ask you, because a lot of the folks that I work with and talk to, they struggle with communicating with their employees because there are so many messages that companies send to their employees that they can get lost and people just tune them out. And then when it comes to the important messages, it's hard to get people to engage and pay attention to them. And I was thinking about this as being such an effective tool, but if somebody opens up an email and just sees 6 paragraphs of text, that alone, no matter how gripping the story is, just that visual of seeing that amount of content can turn people off. So how do you see people using this specifically in email to grab attention quickly?
So again, if you have first of all, I should say that when I first started my agency, my specialty was internal communications. That's what I did. That's what I did for Nike and Lego and all these big companies. And because it's a big pain point for a lot of companies. But I think that there are ways, like, for example, the example that I just gave, a visual like that will get people's attention, right? That's not the whole message, but the first step in communications today that I don't think people get is that our attention span is basically non-existent anymore. We're like there was a quote in the book about, I used to deep sea dive. I now flit on a jet ski. And that is basically what we're all doing. We're all flitting on the jet ski of information that is coming our way every day. And so your first battle, if it's an internal audience, if it's an external audience, if it's the people that you're selling to, is to get their attention, right? Which is why I think metaphoric storytelling, if it can do that to start off with, you're halfway there, right? And then the second challenge you have is building trust. So, and I don't think that happens in one email, right? It happens, the building of the trust is a little bit of a longer burn, right? But I feel like the first step is getting people to listen to what you have to say, which is not an easy feat because we're all like, I don't know how many screens you have in front of you, but I've got lots and, all the time. And I know a lot of people just aren't that focused. They're flitting on their jet ski, right? From TikTok to Facebook to LinkedIn to Netflix to, and you're trying these are your employees.
Yeah. Let me ask you about that, because one of the things that you said is that you want to be joining the conversation, not interrupting the conversation. And when we think about getting people's attention, we think of interrupting the conversation. I think, we need to get people are skipping along on the surface with the jet ski, and we need to, pop out of the water in a clown suit and be like, hey, look at me over here, and not come up alongside them and ride with them on our own jet ski. So how what does it mean to join the conversation versus interrupt it? And then how do we do that in a way that still draws attention?
Well, that's an interesting question in the sense that to me, most business communication today is really built on a sort of a 20th century model, right? Pre all this insanity with internet. And I don't think people understand to what depths our worlds have been transformed. And, like when, there were like a handful of mobile phones in the late 80s. There were a handful of websites. There were no social media platforms. And you fast forward to today, and we're all just completely inundated, no matter where we live. And the thing that is interesting about all of that, so you've got all of this sort of data and information that's pouring down on us, right? So logic would say the people who are going to get the attentions are the ones that scream the loudest, right? But actually, what is happening is that the people that are screaming the loudest are making the situation even worse. Because the more desperate people come to have their messages heard, the louder they're screaming, the more we turn off, because it's like, it's like this tsunami of messages. We just there's a reason half the ads are blocked. There's a reason people do that, and so I personally think the better way to talk to people is to do it in the spirit of relationship building versus I want to get in front of your face, right? And it can be a longer burn, but why not talk to people about things that they're already thinking about and they're already talking about rather than trying to interrupt that conversation? Because screaming louder isn't going to work. That's a 20th century model way of communicating. That doesn't work anymore because they're savvier, they're more intelligent, and they're inundated. We're all kind of stressed out by all this data, and our brains literally can't, we just simply can't compute it anymore. So, but a little bit of a gentler approach will, I believe, get people to a little bit of a surprising approach. See, when I say join the conversation, I'm not saying join the conversation in a monotone tone. When you start doing these comparisons, people will listen. They're like, what the heck? Why is she talking about that? And so I guess it's interrupting in a much more gentle way and using the vehicles that you're interrupting with are things that they're already thinking about. They're already thinking about, who performed at halftime or what Meghan and Harry said to whoever, right? Or whatever, they're already thinking about these sort of things. So why not use them as a way to pop into the conversation? So it also, there's a generosity to that. Seth Godin talks about generosity in communications. And I think that's so important. So, if you are meeting someone for the first time, you don't just start talking about yourself and what you can do and how you can serve them. You
hopefully not.
Figure out.
I know plenty of people who do, but hopefully not.
I do. I know a few people too, but that doesn't work, right? What works is tell me about, what you're doing and tell me about and that is the spirit in which I believe we need to be talking as businesses. I don't know what it is. I don't know. People sort of have this belief that businesses need to talk a certain way. But the beauty of social media and technology is that we can talk to each other as human beings. Let's bring the humanity back into business communication. And it doesn't mean it's less serious. It means it works better, right? That's the thing that I think people are missing is that because the more we try to interrupt and we try to, kind of basically push our message down people's throats, the more they back off. I always think of the story of when I worked at BBDO, the guy who was a creative director who sadly passed, His name is Phil Duesenberg, very, very famous creative. And I remember going into meetings with him, and he would talk like this. You'd have to lean forward to hear him. And you know what? That worked much better than him screaming at everyone. Let's stop the shouting and maybe start talking a little bit more softly so that people have to lean into what we're saying, which I know sounds counterintuitive, but everyone's upping the ante and trying to scream louder. It doesn't seem to work. Or it can work in the short term, but it won't work in the long term.
Yeah. There's a big difference there too. And that's a mistake a lot of people make, right? Is you play with short-term strategies when you're actually playing a long-term game.
Yeah, I do that. I think that's a really big problem, that the people aren't playing the long game. And the long game is relationship building. The long game, that's what the long game is. And you cannot do that with like the latest sort of trick to get people pull out their wallets. And the people I know who spend time relationship building really win in the long run. But in fairness to people, a lot of people just don't know how to do that at a business level. They know how to do it at a personal level. But I think using vehicles like Tiny Thunder, it's not the only answer, obviously. But, it's like customer service. There's a whole sort of integrated whole, an approach. I mean, I'm sure you've had that experience where you've had a first sort of look at a company and right away, this is a company you want to be around.
For sure.
The customer support is great. And you also vice versa when it's not as welcoming.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So that's what I mean about joining the conversation. If hopefully that makes sense.
No, it does. One of the things I hear you saying, or the way I interpret it when you talk about joining the conversation, and this is especially true for work, is I think there's either a fear or people feel like it's not appropriate to be talking about the personal stuff that people are talking about. They say, okay, hey, you're talking about this personal stuff over here, but come for now and pay attention to this business stuff, this important stuff. And what I hear you saying is it's more powerful to pay attention to what the people are talking about and then use those topics as door openers into the more important subject matter that you want to be talking about. So you're using those common subjects as the gateway to get to the thing you actually want to be talking about.
Right, because we haven't talked about that. I think it's really important that the segue is made, right, between the two things.
Yeah. Can you explain how to make that segue?
So the way I see it in a very logical way is this. You decided what it is that you want to communicate, your special process, your product, whatever it is that you want to communicate. You choose a story that you feel illustrates the value of that idea. But then that's just the beginning piece. You tell the story, but then you need to kind of explain what the lesson of the story is. Why am I talking to you about the guy in the plane? Because it makes me realize how important mentorship is, or guidance is, or support is, right? And here at X company, these are the kinds of things that we do. We'd let and then you invite them to a phone call or whatever it is that you want them to do. But there are three distinct steps. The story, which is a purposeful story that illustrates something. The lesson of the story, which is, why mentorship is so important, just in this particular example. And then an invitation for the viewer or the reader to take an action, whether it's watching a video, picking up the phone, responding to an email, whatever it is. But the story can't just hang on its own for it to be effective in a business sense. Well, actually, in any sense, you can use this as a parent. You can use this as a teacher as well. It's an effective, you can use this messaging technique in so many different situations, but it can't just hang in the air all by itself. It needs to have a point to it. if that makes sense. It needs it,
and you have to help make that point. As much as they may get it, you need to sort of drive the last nail in, just to say, and this is what I took from that.
Yeah, this is, why am I talking about this? Well, because I believe X is important, whatever X is, right? And that's why here at our company, we have this product, right? And I'd love you to check it out, et cetera, et cetera. But without that piece, it's fun and it's a metaphoric storytelling that everyone will remember, but the point is to get people to take an action. The point is to invite people to take a certain action, depending on what your sales cycle is.
Well, and you've illustrated this a few times already in this conversation. You talked about the LinkedIn video with the car turning around and the treacherous mountains. And, I was listening to you and I could kind of visualize that and go, oh my God, I could feel, how watching that video would make you tense. And then you said the line from the ad or the post, which was, anybody can turn your life around. And immediately I was like, wow, that is powerful. And you think about the visual of that, and no matter how treacherous it feels, everybody can do it. But that hadn't clicked with me until you said it. And the same with the plane story. I heard the story. There's a bunch of things you can take out of that story, but until you said, the line about most of us feel like we don't know what we're doing, and it's important to have somebody there to guide you, you go like, oh God, yeah, that totally makes sense. But it's like you've got, I don't know, I'm trying to find a metaphor for your metaphor, but it's like that last puzzle piece that goes in the middle, and suddenly you can see what the whole thing means. You can see the whole image more clearly. So that makes a lot of sense.
The other thing that's great about it, because, I know everyone today is talking about AI a lot and AI, copy. The thing that's great about this method is it completely makes you unique and original in your communications, and AI proof, because the danger of AI, I think AI is actually a really interesting tool, by the way, but the danger of it is that we're already all sounding very similar. Like, I worry that we're going to even sound more similar now when everyone's copying, pasting from the same prompts, from the same AI. And what's great about this method, which is, you don't want to blend into the background. You want to stand out. You want to sell your stuff. You don't want to be, we live in a lookalike world, and you don't want to be one of the lookalikes, right? And how you communicate, how you use your words, and how you think about it. You look at someone like Steve Jobs, right? He was quintessential metaphoric storyteller from the get-go, from the very beginning. And there's a reason why Apple, people forget this, but it didn't even deserve to exist at a certain point. It was like really not doing well at a certain point in time. And the way he communicated gave it its I believe, people might disagree with me, but I believe gave Apple its magic that still exists today, even though it doesn't always deserve it, right? It has a magic. And I think a lot of it was the way he communicated. He didn't talk about, when he introduced the iPod, he didn't talk about, well, we can do this and that, and the widget's this, and no, he said, you have 1,000 songs in your pocket. That is beautiful imagery. You will have 1,000 songs now it seems like very little, 1,000 songs, but never mind that. But he had an ability to, and of course the classic, and I'm not sure everyone remembers this ad, but the classic 1984 ad that was aired once, people are still talking about.
Yeah,
and
the
that
Super
was a
Bowl
metaphoric
ad.
Story.
Yeah.
But it was a metaphoric story. He was using 1984 to metaphorically depict Microsoft. And Apple was, the free, independent, creative individual battling the monolithic gray world of Microsoft.
Well, and that same metaphor continues to play out in their ads, now. If you think about, remember the ads, I don't know, it was in the aughts, 2000 and aughts, where they had the Mac and the Apple were two people. I think it was like Justin Long and somebody else. And they, one was very stodgy and one was very hip and very modern. And you could see, it was metaphoric. It was right there in front of you. You could see the difference in personality. That was just a continuation of the same 1984 theme that they had originally launched with.
Absolutely. But he did it. Remember, I don't know if you remember the ad where it's about the rebels, and he had all, Martin Luther King, and, it's about, being a rebel and thinking different. People who think different change the world. And like, who doesn't want to be that person, right? Yeah. Okay. I'll buy an Apple. No problem. But he's not saying, if you buy Apple, but he created a whole myth around it. And I think that, again, we can't all be Apple, but I feel like, but what is interesting about Apple was that it was always the color in the gray of all these tech companies, always. And I think a lot of it was the way he communicated. He was very clever about that.
Yeah. Well, that's a great point, too, to reinforce something you said earlier, which you can use the same metaphor over and over and over again and express it in countless ways. So if that's the metaphor he's going for, they used it in the 1984 ad. They used it in the Apple versus Mac personality commercials. They used it in the commercials where everybody was black and white and everything in the world was black and white except for the iPod and the music, like the sound that was coming out of it. That was the only thing that was in stark color. They've used that metaphor over and over and over again, but it always feels fresh because they do it in some way that feels new to the audience, where the audience gets what they're trying to say in a connection they've never made before. So I think that this whole thing illustrates the point.
That is super interesting because actually I've never really, because when I first started my agency back in the 90s, and when I was advising people like Lego and Nike and a bunch of big companies, that's what we were doing. We were looking for, because like the overarching metaphor, right? So, for example, I did a huge study with Salomon, the ski company. I'm a big skier, and we travel all over the world because when I first met them, they were talking about, the fiberglass and the, inches and it was like all very, feature. And I'm like, hang on here. When you're out on the ski slope, there's nothing more emotional. There's nothing more, skier. Anyone who's listening to this who's a skier can get this, but it's like a very 360 emotional, visual, physical experience. And so anyway, we did this whole giant sort of study with skiers and everything and talking to them about that. And, it was, I feel like, looking for and basically the metaphor was that you enter the zone when you're on the mountain. That was and I feel like
into flow, kind of.
You get the kind of the flow, right? And that was sort of their metaphor. I will say that I came back a few months later and they were still talking about the fiberglass, but it's hard. I think someone who read my book, I think there's a level of discomfort with what I'm talking about because it doesn't feel, for some people, it doesn't feel as solid as they would like. They would rather talk about their widget and how big their widget is and what their widget does, which is all fine. But I feel like encasing your widget into it, wrapping it up in the Tiffany box of metaphoric storytelling will just strengthen your proposition. It won't weaken it. And but so there's an overarching metaphoric storytelling as well as little ways of using it in the way I like to think of every single metaphoric story that you tell is like a little sales ambassador going out and talking on your behalf.
Well, Sue, this has been a fantastic conversation, and I love kind of how we wrapped it up there. talking about originally sort of setting the stage, then talking about how you can use these. And then I love just the concept of thinking about the broader holistic metaphor and all the different ways you can play that out. And you talked about doing it in text, in verbal communication, in imagery. There's just all sorts of ways that people can play with this stuff. And I'll reiterate a point that you said at the beginning of this, which is it is a muscle. And so the more you're paying attention to the lessons that are coming out of the stories, the easier it's going to be to see those lessons and then to use those stories in your own communication. So I think I would just encourage people. I'm trying to encourage myself to be paying attention to this more often, because I think it's so related to what I do as a salesperson, as a leader in my business, as a father, as a friend. There's so much here. And I think if we can start communicating in these types of visuals and stories, it just makes our communications better. It makes them richer, makes things more fun as well.
It's a lot of fun. I'm glad you brought that up. It's a lot of fun. Let's start having a bit more fun. Doesn't have to be so dead serious, right?
Amen. I'm with you. Well, thank you for coming on. Really appreciate it. And I would encourage anybody who has enjoyed this to pick up a copy of Tiny Thunder. It's a fantastic book, and it is both instructive and illustrative. You use the concepts to teach the concepts, which is always a great way to reinforce the learning. So anybody who's interested, I would encourage you to go pick that up. And anybody who wants help telling their own stories, this is what Sue does professionally. So I will share all the links where you can reach her in the show notes, and wish everybody the best of luck in your storytelling. Hey folks, one last thing before you go. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure to hit subscribe so you can stay up to date with future guests. That's it. Thanks for coming. Go make the most of your business and the people in it.